Our solar system is the region of space which falls within the gravitational influence of our Sun. The solar system is thought to have begun forming about 5 billion years ago from a giant spinning cloud of gas and dust. The core of this cloud grew under the influence of gravity and became denser and hotter. As material fell towards the growing core, the cloud increased in speed and flattened into a giant spinning disk. Eventually, the increasing temperature generated enough energy to trigger nuclear fusion. This fusion marked the birth of our Sun. The lighter gas was swept far out into the solar system, leaving heavier, rockier material and metallics with high melting points nearer the Sun. Molten metal and dust particles stuck together to form clusters, which in turn stuck together to form rocks. Mutual gravity caused these rocks to come together, eventually to form planets. In the hot inner regions of the solar system, rocky planets with metal cores were formed.
In the proto-Earth, temperatures rose and the planet softened until the inward pull of gravity could even out bulges and dimples, and the body became a sphere. Within the hot proto-Earth, iron started to melt, and because of its high density, this iron sank towards the center, accumulating to form a metallic core. Convecting hot rock remained behind and became the Earth's mantle. This process of separating into a core and mantle is called differentiation. Meanwhile, meteorites continued to rain onto the surface of the proto-Earth until eventually our home planet had cleared its orbit of all other matter. At that point, the Earth had become a true planet. After formation, the Earth cooled and its crust became solid. But continuing meteorite impacts probably pulverized and remelted its crust at various times. One of these impacts, not long after the Earth had formed, was catastrophic. It blasted apart and probably vaporized much of both bodies. Debris from this collision sprayed into orbit around the newborn Earth. Gravity quickly grabbed hold of this debris and pulled it into a new ring. Fairly rapidly, this debris collected into a ball, producing a new body, our Moon. After some time, the Earth cooled to form a solid crust again, but it remained hot enough that volcanic activity occurred, gradually producing the gases that made a dense atmosphere, rich in water and carbon dioxide. Eventually, the Earth became cool enough for most of the water in the atmosphere to condense and collect into oceans. Then, most carbon dioxide could dissolve in the water, leaving a clearer air consisting mostly of nitrogen. Only much later, after the appearance of photosynthetic organisms, did the Earth become rich enough in oxygen to make it habitable for multicellular organisms.
The oceans have been here for almost 4 billion years, carving the coastline, driving the climate, and controlling the destiny of life itself. But 4.5 billion years ago, when our planet was born, it was just a molten inferno. There was no place for any liquid water at all. Yet the ingredients needed to create water were there, locked away deep inside the Earth when the planet formed. As the first volcanoes erupted, one of the gases that billowed out was steam. And as the planet cooled, it formed clouds. It rained for thousands of years. As the first rivers formed, they began to fill up the lower-lying areas on our young planet, possibly creating the first oceans. But it's reckoned that even this relentless downpour only delivered around half the water that makes up our oceans today. The rest came from outer space. This is a comet, filmed in 2005. It's about 4 miles across, and like all comets, it's made of rock and water in the form of ice. To discover just how much water comets contain, scientists deliberately crashed a space probe straight into it. After it ploughed into the surface, more than 250,000 tons of water burst into space. In Earth's formative years, it was hit by thousands of comets like this. By the time the bombardment finished, it's thought they'd delivered up to half the water in our oceans.
How did life begin? Or at least how did life begin on Earth? This is a question that many of us are curious about, and biologists are working extremely hard to try to figure it out. One possible way this could have happened is that there was a single type of biological molecule that eventually evolved into all of life. Now, a reason to think something like that might have happened is that all life we know on Earth contains the same biological molecules, namely DNA, RNA, and amino acids. RNA is particularly interesting because not only does it encode genetic information, it also can act as a catalyst for chemical reactions. So one hope is that RNA formed in the early times on the Earth, before there was life, and then began to replicate itself. So that sounds maybe very simple, but it's extraordinarily complicated. First, simply by the fact that we don't know what the early Earth looked like. However, there has been some progress in creating subunits of RNA in a laboratory with very simple chemical compounds and ultraviolet light. A subunit of RNA is a phosphate molecule, a sugar molecule, and a base. There are 4 kinds of bases. We can label them with letters, A, G, U, and C. And those letters, in a sense, when you have a strand of them, tell a story. They contain an enormous amount of information, and there is your genetic code. So if in a lab you can see how, just from chemical processes, you can produce a subunit of RNA, and then watch RNA grow, and eventually, if it's possible, have it replicate itself, then you've at least demonstrated the possibility of how life could have formed. Now, of course, life could have started not with RNA, but something even before that, with molecules that don't exist now, say proto-RNA. Or perhaps life actually came from another planet. It landed here on a meteor and it began to grow once it found the favorable conditions of the Earth. We don't know, but our best way of figuring it out is going through the processes of reproducing what may have happened at the beginning of life.
Have you ever wondered how Earth became the only known planet that contains oxygen? Scientists theorize that Earth's atmosphere started off without any oxygen, and that it took billions of years for the right conditions to arise that allowed for the accumulation of air, which supports life as we know it on our planet. 2 studies from researchers at the University of Southern Denmark have been published recently that pertain to the history of oxygen on Earth. By analyzing the chemical makeup of rocks, geochemists were able to find evidence of oxygen levels that existed in the ancient atmosphere. Because oxygen readily bonds with other molecules, there is substantial historical evidence in the geological record of how much oxygen was in the atmosphere at different times. Dr. Donald E. Canfield from the University of Southern Denmark and author of the book, Oxygen, A 4 Billion Year History, said that around 2.3 billion years ago, Earth calmed down enough that the balance tipped in the favor of oxygen. Rocks that are around 3 billion years old reportedly have signs that oxygen was in the atmosphere of our planet at that time, but back then, there was only 0.03% of the amount of oxygen that is found on our planet today.
About 450 million years ago, plants took a giant leap out of the oceans onto the land to become the plants that we know and love today. But how did they survive? Scientists at the John Innes Centre may have found out. Land plants survive by getting water and nutrients from the soil. They do this by forming a special friendship with soil-dwelling fungi called mycorrhiza. These strands of mycorrhiza reach deep into the soil and drag the nutrients and water back to the plants. But when the first algae landed on soil, how did they survive long enough to form these beneficial friendships? New research suggests that they already had the genes necessary for forming this bond whilst they still lived in the sea. Researchers analysed DNA and RNA from some of the earliest known land plants and algae. They found evidence that their shared algal ancestors living in the Earth's waters already possessed the necessary set of genes needed to detect and interact with the beneficial mycorrhiza. The team of scientists believes this capability was pivotal in enabling the alga to survive out of the water and to colonize the Earth. By working with the fungi to find sustenance, the alga showed a clear evolutionary advantage and was selected to thrive in a very different and seemingly infertile environment. This was the watershed moment that kick-started the evolution of life on Earth.
Hey guys, Amy making bad jokes for you on D News today, but jokes aside, bones are pretty useful, and not just for giving us the internal stability to not be goopy piles of flesh and organs, but because they persist over the ages and give us vital clues as to the history of various species. It's from fossilized dinosaur bones that we've been able to reconstruct what the Earth might have looked like long before humans roamed, and going back further, it's from bones and fossils that we can trace how species have evolved. The fossil record tells us that life started in primitive oceans before the first species poked their heads out of the water and crawled onto land. These are so-called transitional species, and scientists have been able to determine that they first appeared when limbs evolved from fish fins about 360 million years ago, followed by the first land-based tetrapods that showed up around 330 million years ago. But there's a pretty big gap in there scientists needed to fill. To figure out what happened during this 30 million year gap, researchers from the Queensland Museum in Hendra, Australia, analyzed a rare tetrapod fossil from that time period, a nearly 5-foot-long Ocinidus that lived about 333 million years ago. They found from preserved forearm bones that the species could support itself on land. Now, whether it did or did not is a different story, and that evidence came from what might be the oldest known broken bone. In studying this broken bone, the team used computer software to reconstruct the forces required to cause the break. It turns out that it was a lot of force, much larger than the animal itself. And because water acts as a cushion, there's no way such a bad break could have happened underwater. The transitional animal that left that broken bone must have been on land. From reconstructing the break, the team concluded that the animal likely fell from a rock or log about 3 feet off the ground. Of course, they can't be sure, but it's pretty probable given the bone-based evidence. So if the Ocinidus broke a bone on land, it must have spent at least some time out of the water, and that makes it the oldest known tetrapod to be fairly well adapted to life on land, getting us one step closer to nailing down the moment when animals first left the water.